Ever wondered how an empire is born? It's not just about kings and armies, it's about momentum. Think of it like a snowball rolling down a hill, getting bigger and faster with every turn. Every empire in history started with this unstoppable push. Let's look at Rome. For centuries, Rome was just one power among many in Italy, but then came the Punic Wars. After a long, brutal struggle, they finally defeated their great rival, Carthage. This victory wasn't just a military win, it was a psychological one. It created an explosion of confidence that rippled through Roman society. Suddenly, they weren't just defending themselves, they were expanding. This newfound belief in their own destiny propelled their legions across the Mediterranean, from Spain to Syria. Victory bred confidence, and confidence fueled an empire. Fast forward a couple thousand years to Britain. What was their secret? The Industrial Revolution. Britain didn't just build an empire with soldiers, they built it with machines. Steam engines, factories, and a powerful navy turned this small island into a global workshop. They could produce goods, ships, and weapons faster and cheaper than anyone else. This industrial might was the engine of their expansion, allowing them to project power and influence across every continent. The sun, as they said, never set on the British Empire, all thanks to the power of steam and steel. Now, let's talk about the United States. After World War II, much of the world was in ruins. Europe and Asia were devastated, but America stood largely untouched. Its factories, which had been churning out weapons for the war, were ready to switch to consumer goods. Its economy was booming. This is where the momentum kicked in. Through initiatives like the Marshall Plan, the US poured money into rebuilding Europe. But this wasn't just charity. It rebuilt Europe in America's image, under American influence, with the US dollar as the world's dominant currency. It was economic power, not just military might, that established the American era. You see the pattern. In this early stage, growth is explosive. Resistance seems weak or disorganized. The rising power feels unstoppable, as if history itself is on their side. This is the intoxicating moment when a nation starts to believe it's destined for greatness, the very moment an empire is born. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be at the absolute top? I mean, on top of the world. Let's talk about empires at their peak. That dangerous moment when power feels eternal, precisely because nothing looks broken yet. Imagine ancient Rome. They didn't just have a big army. They controlled the entire Mediterranean Sea, calling it our sea. Their legendary roads weren't just for local travel. They connected continents, from the misty shores of Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia. Roman law wasn't a suggestion. It was the code that governed the lives of millions of people across vastly different cultures. For a Roman citizen standing in the Forum, it must have felt like their world, their order, was destined to last forever. They had built something so vast, so organized, it seemed indestructible. Fast forward a few centuries to the British Empire. Their power wasn't just on land. The Royal Navy was the undisputed master of the oceans, controlling global trade routes that were the lifeblood of the world's economy. If you wanted to ship goods from India to Europe, you did it on their terms. This was the empire on which the sun famously never set. From Canada to Australia, from India to Africa, their influence was everywhere. Standing in London, the financial capital of the world, you would believe this dominance was a natural, permanent state of affairs. And then, the 20th century, the rise of the United States. It wasn't just about military might, though they had plenty of that. The US dollar became the world's money, the standard for international trade. American-led alliances like NATO became the backbone of global security. And perhaps most powerfully, Hollywood became the world's storyteller, shaping culture, dreams, and aspirations from Tokyo to Timbuktu. The American way of life was exported and admired globally. To an American in the post-Cold War era, it seemed their nation's leadership was the unshakable foundation of the modern world. But here's the critical lesson hidden in each of these stories. At this peak stage, a dangerous shift happens. Power starts to feel permanent. Leaders, comfortable in their success, can stop listening to new ideas or criticisms. The very systems that created their success, the laws, the trade networks, the armies, can become rigid and stop evolving. And this is the great trap. Empires begin to mistake their temporary success for immortality. They forget that the only constant in history is change. This illusion of permanence is often the first crack in the foundation of the mightiest powers. Have you ever noticed that empires never seem to know when to stop? It's like a universal rule. They expand and expand until they just can't anymore. Let's take a trip back in time to the Roman Empire. At its peak, Rome's borders stretched all the way from Britain to the Middle East. Imagine trying to manage that. The armies required to defend such a vast territory became incredibly expensive. Eventually, the cost of just holding on to what they had became greater than the value of conquering new lands. The empire started bleeding resources, not from a single fatal wound, but from 1,000 tiny cuts along its endless frontiers. It was a slow, quiet, but constant drain that ultimately contributed to its fall. Fast forward a few centuries to the British Empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire, they used to say, and it was true. They had colonies spread across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. But managing this global enterprise was a nightmare. The administrative costs absolutely exploded, and with so many different cultures and peoples under one rule, revolts became a constant headache. The empire was fighting fires on multiple fronts, both militarily and financially. The sheer size and complexity of it all became a crushing weight, making it impossible to sustain in the long run. Now, let's bring it to the modern day and consider the United States. With over 700 military bases scattered across the globe, it has a presence everywhere. But this global power has come with a heavy price tag. Think about the long, drawn-out wars in places like Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. These conflicts often lacked clear victories and came at an immense cost in both lives and treasure. What started as a projection of power slowly turned into a global obligation, and over time, that obligation has become a significant burden. This is the classic pattern. It's the moment an empire's reach exceeds its grasp. The bleeding starts slowly, quietly, but constantly. History shows us this is the point where the foundation of even the mightiest powers begins to crack. Have you ever wondered what really brings down an empire? It's not always the epic battles or dramatic political coups you see in the movies. Often, it starts with something much quieter, something that happens right in people's pockets. The collapse of an empire often begins with the collapse of its economy. When money stops making sense, the foundation of power starts to crack. Let's take a trip back to ancient Rome, the mighty Roman Empire, a civilization that spanned centuries and continents. How did it begin to falter? It started with their money. The emperors began debasing their coins, mixing cheaper metals like copper and tin with silver. They thought they could create more money out of thin air to pay for their massive armies and lavish projects. But people aren't stupid. They quickly realized their coins were worth less. This led to rampant inflation. Prices for everyday goods soared. Trust in the currency, and by extension, trust in the government, completely eroded. Soldiers, the backbone of the empire, started demanding more and more devalued coins for their service, leading to instability and civil unrest. The economic poison was spreading. Now, let's fast forward to a more recent empire, Great Britain. At its peak, the sun never set on the British Empire. But two devastating world wars changed everything. These wars weren't just fought on the battlefields, they were fought with money. Britain drained its treasury to fund the war effort. They were forced to borrow massive amounts of money, primarily from the United States. This debt became a crushing weight. By the end of World War II, Britain had lost its status as the world's primary creditor and became a debtor nation. It lost its financial independence, and with it, its ability to project power across the globe. The economic engine that fueled the empire had run out of steam. So, where does that leave us today? Let's look at the United States. For decades, it has been the world's undisputed economic superpower. But are there warning signs? The national debt has ballooned into the trillions. To deal with economic crises, the solution has often been to print more money, a modern version of debasing the currency. This has led to concerns about inflation and the devaluation of the dollar. We're also seeing a widening gap between the rich and the poor, as wealth becomes concentrated in fewer hands. Whether it's debasing coins, borrowing heavily, or printing trillions, the methods might be different, but the pattern is eerily similar. When an empire starts borrowing from its own future to pay for its present, it's a sign that the ground beneath it is starting to shift. History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. Do you know what the most dangerous stage for any great power is? It's not a foreign invasion or a rival nation. History tells us a far more chilling story. Empires rarely fall because they're conquered from the outside. They almost always collapse from within. Think about the Roman Empire. At its peak, it seemed invincible. But what brought it down? A series of devastating civil wars. Political assassinations became routine. The very fabric of society frayed as loyalty shifted away from the state and towards powerful individuals, generals, and politicians. The enemy wasn't at the gates. It was inside the Senate, in the barracks, and in the streets of Rome itself. Fast forward a couple of millennia to the British Empire, the empire on which the sun never set. External challenges were constant, but the real cracks appeared internally. Fierce colonial resistance movements drained resources and morale. Closer to home, Irish rebellions demanded independence, challenging the very idea of a united kingdom. A loss of unity and purpose at home made it impossible to maintain control abroad. Now, let's consider the present. Many observers look at the United States and see similar warning signs. We hear about it every day. Extreme political polarization, where the two sides see each other not as opponents, but as enemies. We see cultural fragmentation, where different groups feel like they're living in completely different realities. This erosion of a shared national identity, of a common story, is a serious threat. The lesson from history is crystal clear. When the citizens of a great nation stop believing they are part of the same system, when they lose faith in their shared institutions and values, the empire is already deeply wounded. The bonds that hold a society together are far more important than any army or economy, because once those bonds break, the collapse is not a matter of if, but when. Have you ever wondered what happens when an entire society stops believing in its own story? It's a quiet process, almost invisible at first. The big institutions, the grand buildings, the familiar rituals, they all still exist. But underneath, the trust, the faith that held it all together, has vanished. Think about ancient Rome. The Senate, once the heart of the Republic, continued to meet. Senators still wore their togas and delivered grand speeches, but everyone knew it was just a show. Real power had shifted elsewhere, and corruption was the new language of governance. The institution was a hollow shell, its legitimacy gone long before the city itself fell. Fast forward to the 20th century, and look at the Soviet Union. For decades, the ideology of communism was preached in every school, every workplace, every public square. But by the 1980s, the belief was gone. People went through the motions, they attended the rallies, but in private, they joked about the system. They had stopped pretending to believe, even to themselves. And once that collective faith evaporated, the entire superpower crumbled in a shockingly short time. Or consider the British Empire. At its height, it wasn't just held together by armies and ships, but by a powerful idea of moral authority and a civilizing mission. But as the world changed, that story lost its power. The very idea of colonial rule became seen as unjustifiable, not just by the people being ruled, but by many back in Britain itself. The moral foundation had cracked, and without it, the empire couldn't last. This pattern repeats throughout history. It's a crucial lesson for us today. When the legitimacy of our systems, our governments, our shared values dies, power inevitably follows. The structures might stand for a while, but they become ghosts, haunting a world that has already moved on. It's a reminder that the most powerful force in any society isn't its armies or its wealth, but the shared beliefs of its people. When those beliefs change, everything changes. Have you ever wondered how empires really end? We often picture a dramatic, fiery collapse, like a supernova explosion. But history tells a different story. Empires don't just collapse, they are replaced. It's less of a bang and more of a slow, quiet fade into irrelevance. Let's take a look at the Roman Empire. We think of its fall in 476 AD, but did it really just vanish overnight? Not at all. The real power, wealth, and culture had already been shifting eastward for decades. The center of gravity moved to a new city, Constantinople, which became the heart of the Byzantine Empire. This new empire carried on the Roman legacy for another 1,000 years. Rome didn't explode. Its influence was simply inherited by a successor. Fast forward a few centuries to the British Empire, the empire on which the sun never set. It was the undisputed global superpower for over 100 years. But did it end in a cataclysmic war or a violent revolution? No. After 2 world wars, Britain was exhausted and financially drained. A new power, the United States, with its industrial might and economic strength, was ready to step into the leadership role. The transition was gradual, almost peaceful. The scepter of global dominance was passed across the Atlantic, not seized in a bloody battle. Then there's the more recent example of the Soviet Union. In 1991, it didn't collapse in a massive civil war. It simply dissolved. The Berlin Wall came down, its satellite states declared independence, and the hammer and sickle flag was lowered for the last time. What replaced it? Not a single new empire, but a more complex, multipolar world where power is shared among several major players, including the United States, China, and a resurgent Russia. So, what's the pattern here? Empires rarely die in a blaze of glory. Their end is much more subtle. They become slow, rigid, and unable to adapt to new challenges. Meanwhile, new, more dynamic powers rise, ready to take their place. The old empire doesn't get conquered. It just becomes irrelevant. It's a powerful lesson from history. True power lies not in holding on, but in adapting and evolving. The world is always changing, and the empires that forget this are the ones that fade into the history books. Have you ever wondered why great empires fall? It's a question that has echoed through the halls of history for thousands of years. From the sun-baked stones of Rome to the wind-swept plains of the Mongol steppes, every great power has eventually met its end. But why? What is the common thread that links the destinies of these mighty civilizations? The answer is both simple and terrifyingly human. History offers a consistent warning, a pattern that repeats itself time and time again. It's not about external enemies or military defeat, not at first. The real danger comes from within. It's born from the very thing that made these empires great in the first place. Power. Power, especially unchecked power, has a strange and corrosive effect. It creates a kind of blindness, a dangerous sense of invincibility. When an empire is at its absolute peak, when its armies seem unbeatable and its wealth seems endless, a deadly complacency begins to set in. The leaders and the people start to believe their own legends. They think the rules of history no longer apply to them. They believe they are the exception. This is the critical moment. Empires don't collapse when they are weak and struggling for survival. They collapse when they are at their strongest, when they believe they cannot possibly fall. It's the moment they stop listening to warnings, dismiss criticism, and ignore the cracks appearing in their own foundations. They become arrogant, overextended, and deaf to the lessons of the past. Think about it. The Romans saw themselves as an eternal city, destined to rule forever, even as internal corruption and political infighting ate away at their core. The British Empire, on which the sun never set, believed its global dominance was a permanent state of being, failing to see the rising tide of independence movements around the world. In every case, the downfall was preceded by an unshakable belief in their own permanence. The pattern never changes. Only the names on the monuments and the dates in the history books are different. Power breeds arrogance. Arrogance breeds blindness. And blindness leads directly to the fall. It's a cycle as old as civilization itself, a warning etched into the ruins of every fallen throne. This is the story we are going to explore. The story of how the mighty become convinced of their own immortality, right before they vanish into dust. This is the moment when thrones fall. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our journey into the heart of history's greatest collapses. Thanks for watching.